Okay, well, welcome to the night's class. Just one second, let me get myself situated here. We had a little technical difficulties getting the camera going, but now that we have it, we can begin. So 40 years ago, this March, Ronald Reagan gave a primetime address to the American people from the Oval Office, in which he was discussing the strategic crisis at the time, the heightening tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the danger of nuclear conflict, and what to do about it. And at the end of the very end of the speech, Ronald Reagan announced that he was going to commit the scientific community of the United States to put all their efforts into developing new technologies that would render nuclear weapons obsolete. Reagan said that the then current war prevention measures that were that prevented nuclear war, called mutually assured destruction, which was the doctrine that nuclear war would not be fought because the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear capability to annihilate the other, that the threat of mutually assured destruction, which went by the acronym MAD, would prevent each side from ever launching a nuclear war. And President Reagan said this is unacceptable, and we have to adopt a new policy which would actually make nuclear weapons obsolete. And this policy later became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, many of Reagan's advisors were surprised that he inserted this into his speech when it had been taken out of the speech by collaborators of George H.W. Bush, who was his vice president. But what many people watching that speech were surprised to hear, were not so surprised to hear, I should say, but they were surprised that Reagan said it, because they recognized that the true author of this policy, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was Lyndon LaRouche, who ran for president in 1976 and again in 1980. And he put out this pamphlet, which you can get on the LaRouchePAC, a link to on the LaRouchePAC website, called the Sputnik of the 70s. The science behind the Soviets' beam weapon program. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole history of LaRouche's role in the development of the SDI tonight, the details of it. Keisha will post a link in the chat to a page on the LaRouchePAC website that recounts this history and has a lot of resources for your study. But it's a history that's very much important for you to study and also for Americans to know. What I'm going to do tonight is to discuss what how the principles on which the SDI was based are applicable to the situation today. Now, the situation today, of course, is very, very different in many respects than the situation in 1983 and the late 70s. But nevertheless, there are many similarities to that situation. And therefore, if we look at the principles on which the SDI, LaRouche's concept of the SDI was based, I think we will be able to understand how those principles need to be understood right now by the American people, so that we can make a shift from the current utopian dreams, which lead to confrontation, and into the kind of policy that LaRouche was emphasizing, one based on scientific and technological collaboration, cooperation, development for the common aims of mankind. Now, I will be discussing that. I want to discuss these principles with you and some of the similarities and differences in the coming minutes. But first, I think it's best to just start out with a short 7.5-minute video that we put together on LaRouchePAC, which are excerpts from a speech that LaRouche gave in the year 2000, in which he gives a very succinct summary of what the principles of the SDI, as he developed them, were. So, Keisha, if you could show that video, that would be the best way to get this discussion started.
February 1982, I held a conference, a very large attended conference in Washington, D.C. It was 400 or 500 celebrities of various nations, largely military and others, U.S. government, East Bloc governments, European, Western European governments. And I presented at that time what I presented as the alternative to Kissinger's policy. The policy, this is the policy which became known as Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the important thing is to understand what the original SDI was, contrary to the idiocy which you hear in the press today about missile defense, which what you hear in the press is idiocy by people who are worse than idiots, and they don't know anything about missile defense. So what we have to do is something completely different. We do have the ability to devise systems, new kinds of physical systems, which could deal effectively with thermonuclear missiles, that is, render them effectively technologically obsolete down the line. But that was not the extent of my proposal. The proposal was that instead of having the Soviet Union and the United States engage in this crazy chicken game called SALT I and ABM, why don't we find a way out of the conflict itself? How? Because the Soviet economy, like the US economy, is collapsing. The present policies of the US economy, the present policies of the Soviet economy ensure a collapse of those economies, physical collapse. So why don't we change the policy? Why don't we go back to the space program of Kennedy? And let's do what we proved with Kennedy. Remember, according to the estimates which were made in the middle of the 1970s, the United States got more than a dime of additional GNP out of every penny the United States invested in the space program, the Kennedy space program. The point is that since increases in productivity come directly only from improvements in technology derived from fundamental scientific discoveries, the higher the rate you convert fundamental physical discoveries into practice, the greater the rate of increase of productivity per capita of population and per square kilometer of area. The problem of both the Soviet system and our own, though in different degrees, I said at the time, was that the United States was not generating a rate of net growth in physical productivity sufficient to maintain the economy. Therefore, we needed a program for forced draft, science-driven, technological progress with some mission, like the moon mission. But as a byproduct of that mission, such as the moon mission, we would generate spillovers in terms of technological progress by such a crash program to put the United States economy back on the plus side in terms of net growth. The Soviet economy does not work for similar reasons, different but similar reasons. Therefore, if the Soviet Union, with its vast military, scientific, technological capability, were to put that capability in cooperation with us in global technological progress. And if we focused upon developing countries, South America, Africa, Asia, to do what Roosevelt proposed be done for these countries had he not died, then the benefit of such a program would put the two things, would put the two economies back on the plus side together with Europe. And it would also be a way of creating a global agenda which would solve the conflict problem. Now that was the SDI, the original form, which is what Reagan proposed on March 23rd, 1983 in his television broadcast, nothing else. Later, to the Heritage Foundation and other clowns, that definition of SDI was sabotaged and destroyed. Now, we did the same thing later, coming out of 85. We had a friend of ours who died, Kraft Erika, who was a leading space scientist, first for Germany, then for the United States. And he had become a friend of ours. When he died of cancer, Helga, my wife, organized a conference sponsored by others for him. So as part of this thing, we put our heads together. What would we do at a conference? We're going to get his friends from all over the world and so forth, and other interested people involved. We had this conference in Virginia, Reston. What we do? And I said, well, let's take what he wanted to do and go a step further. Now, Kraft Erika's key favorite project was the automatic industrialization of the moon. And he was the man who had been working on the project in the 1950s and later for the industrial development of the moon, with the idea that the moon would be developed as Kraft Erika and others had proposed also. The moon would be developed as a base, an industrial base on which we would build much of the weight of the spacecraft we'd use to explore the solar system more extensively. So I said, why not go to the next step? This is Kraft's project. He laid out a project very well defined. It's one thing to honor it. Let's do something more. Let's go to Mars. So what I did was to take the base work that Kraft had done and others had done, and simply took this and said, here's the obvious. Here's why we have to go to colonize Mars, not to build housing development on Mars, not that sort of thing, but to create a Los Alamos type science city under the surface of Mars, which would be a base for general beyond Mars space exploration into the universe generally, to get away from the sun, because the sun is a very noisy place and you can't see things or hear things clearly with all that noise of this big sun rumbling around up there. So if you get a bit further out at a place with a much thinner atmosphere, you build a science base out there and you use that as a base from which to deploy other pieces of equipment into Mars nearby space. Then you can conduct observations of the universe, which we can't do from Earth. We can do them. We can get into frequencies and so forth we otherwise can't get into. And this was. But I said the reason for doing this, it would be fairly estimated. It would take us 40 years to get a landing on Mars under these kinds of conditions. So let's do it. Why? Because of the spin-off benefits of the science driver project needed to make it in 40 years. It may take you 40 years to get to Mars, but you're going to get a lot of benefits on Earth from the technological spillover in the short run.
If you pay close attention to what LaRouche said in that short clip, you should have picked up what the subject of our discussion is tonight. Now, let me fill in a few of the background to what led up to the period, to the announcement of the SDI, and why Lynn's proposal, as he just summarized there, was absolutely unique. I don't want to go into a big long history because it would actually detract from the principles. But the basic facts at the time were that since the end of World War II, and with the sabotage of the plans of Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt's death to use the industrial and economic capability of the United States that he had developed to get the US out of the Depression and to maintain the industrial capacity to win the war. Roosevelt had proposed that that capacity be turned loose on developing the newly freed colonial colonies from the empires, especially the British Empire, French Empire, Dutch Empire, Spanish Empire, and so forth, Portuguese Empire, that Roosevelt insisted would be dismantled by the United States at the end of the war. Roosevelt, of course, died. There was an immediate effort on the part of the British Empire to reestablish the British Empire as a kind of world utopian regime, similar to what Biden today calls democracies. And this utopian regime, for the moment, had, to the extent that the British controlled US policy at the time, a monopoly on nuclear weapons. And at that time, Bertrand Russell, who was a leading figure in British policies, British imperial policies, proposed a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union to establish this one world utopian government. Of course, those plans were scotched as soon as the Soviets demonstrated their nuclear capability. And shortly thereafter, beat the United States to the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, and then, of course, the Soviets beat the United States to the first satellite in space and also to the first man in space. So there was a technological race between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which the Soviets, drawing on the great depth of Russian scientific tradition, were making tremendous strides. The United States, meanwhile, as a result of the dismantling of the industrial policy of Roosevelt and the sabotage after the assassination of Kennedy of the reemergence of that in the form of the space program, the Apollo project, was going in the opposite direction. Now, that's not to say that the Soviet economy was progressing, because as Lynn pointed out in that summary, both the Soviet economy, for reasons of problems in the Soviet system, which we can get into if you want, and the United States were going in the wrong direction. But the United States was, at that point, going through a self-generated collapse. The elites in the United States had made a decision to shift from an industrial economy into a financial economy. And the financialization ultimately led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and then a policy in the late 1960s, early 1970s, to what today we call the green policy, environmentalism, deindustrialization, and what the Council of Foreign Relations called at the time controlled disintegration. So by the time of the late 1970s, when this policy was of LaRouche was first introduced, the world was threatened by two forms of the same utopian idea. One was an idea that a mutually assured destruction and building up weapon systems that would function within a domain of mutually assured destruction. And the other, this was promoted by what today we call the neocons. The other was a utopian dream of arms control, peaceniks, that the United States and the Soviet Union could sit down and negotiate treaties to limit the deployment of nuclear weapons, in which both sides intended to cheat on those treaties to maintain mutually assured destruction. And the consequence of that was that the world was sliding closer and closer to nuclear conflict. This was, of course, exacerbated by the election of Jimmy Carter as president, who, along with his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, escalated a so-called arc of crisis and strategy of tension designed to try and collapse the Soviet Union, defeat the Soviet Union and collapse the Soviet Union. So, but at the time, in the 1970s, when LaRouche first developed this policy, US military intelligence officials, especially the former head of Air Force Intelligence, Major General Keegan, stated publicly in an article to Aviation Week in 1977 that the Soviets had succeeded in developing and were working on directed energy beam weapons. These would be beams of high energy particles which could move at close to the speed of light and neutralize any nuclear ballistic missile, whether it was fired from an airplane, ICBM, or submarine. Now, this was not deployable, but the scientific breakthrough had been made. This was leaked to the press, and then LaRouche made the proposal that he summarized, to shift the direction altogether along the lines that we just heard him say. That the problem was the economic policy that the elites in the United States and the Soviet Union were both pursuing, which was collapsing their economies for different reasons, but similar. That unless we had a shift towards a science driver program and a cooperative effort to deploy this science driver policy for the development of not only the United States and the Soviet Union, but also for the developing countries, this regime, this utopian regime, was going to ultimately lead to a nuclear conflict. Now, I guess I would say that the United States was in a little bit better political shape, or maybe that's an exaggeration, than it is today. But LaRouche was running for president. He ran in 1976. He ran again in 1980. And he made this proposal, which later became known as the SDI, as the center point of his campaign. He also conducted international conferences in Europe and in Asia, Japan, Thailand, throughout the United States, mass conferences. He mentioned one in 1982 to build public support for his concept of the Strategic Defense Initiative. He was opposed in this effort, covertly and overtly, by Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, and by Henry Kissinger, among others. LaRouche was the treatment that you now see being meted out to President Donald Trump was all done to LaRouche 40 years ago. And it ultimately led to LaRouche's incarceration several days after George H.W. Bush became president. Now, LaRouche, in the context of his building support for his idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, was engaged in discussions with Soviet representatives and reporting on those discussions to officials in the Reagan administration. And LaRouche was getting, to some extent, some favorable responses from Soviet officials, agreement that they might cooperate with LaRouche's proposal if Reagan adopted it. The Soviets ultimately reported back that Reagan would not adopt it because it would be stopped from within the Reagan administration and also by their allies in the Democratic Party. So I think that's an interesting lesson for today, that you had an alliance between the Bushies, the Democrats, and the Soviet Union to stop Reagan from adopting LaRouche's policy. And if Reagan did so, that they would sabotage it, as LaRouche said they did. LaRouche told the Soviets, if you disagree, if you reject this proposal, your economy will collapse. It's not sustainable under its current regime. He also made the same warning to the United States, that the regime of globalization, which was just coming into existence at that time, deindustrialization, rejection of science driver technologies, would lead to a similar economic collapse in the United States. The first shoe he said, would be the Soviet Union. The second shoe would be the United States, because of the pursuit of the same utopian madness. Now, as I said, LaRouche was incarcerated in January 1989, right after George H.W. Bush became president. And of course, a year later, the Berlin Wall came down as LaRouche had forecast, and a few years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Now, while in prison, LaRouche outlined a renewed policy that was similar, based on the same principles as the SDI, what he called the strategic triangle. He said, you have to look at the deep scientific capability of the former Warsaw Pact countries, especially Russia, ironically Ukraine, the area where the fighting is going on, especially in the eastern Ukraine, which was the center of science and technology and industrial development, and also areas in the Warsaw Pact, which had been historical centers of science and engineering and technology, particularly Eastern Germany, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, or what's today the Czech Republic. And in these areas, these reservoirs of science and engineering and technology should be redirected away from the military focus that had, which was the major focus under the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, in a cooperative effort between with the United States and Western Europe for the economic development of the former Warsaw Pact nations and Russia itself. Instead, George H.W. Bush made an alliance with his old friend Robert Strauss, who had been head of the Democratic Party. He sent Robert Strauss to Moscow as ambassador, Jeffrey Sachs and many others, and they proceeded for a policy of what they called shock therapy, which was another fancy term for basically promoting the mafia, the oligarchs, and looting the entire country and selling everything that was not nailed down. Now, in the last few weeks, some documents have been released under the Freedom of Information Act to the National Security Archives, which is a private organization headquartered at George Washington University, which collects and publishes original documents of historical importance. And they obtained several documents from 1992, which were documents that report on the meetings between George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker, and Russian president at the time, Boris Yeltsin, about a preparation for a meeting to come up in a few months where Yeltsin would travel to the United States and meet with George H.W. Bush in Camp David. And in that meeting, which I believe took place in June of 1992, Yeltsin proposed to Baker and said he was going to make the same proposal to Bush, that the United States and the Soviet Union cooperate on a global strategic defense initiative. He said it would not be space-based, but there should be space cooperation between the United States and Russia on a Moon-Mars mission. And Yeltsin said, we have thousands and thousands of top scientists in Russia who are currently unemployed. They're living on a pittance of a pension, and their intellectual and scientific capability is being wasted. They know how to do things that could help the United States, such as developing cooperation in space. Of course, we all know that it was the superiority of the Russian rocket engines, which are still the designs that are used today. He proposed that the US and Russian scientists could work together to recycle the nuclear warheads from the former Warsaw Pact nations and recycle those warheads into fuel for nuclear power plants. And he had other proposals in areas of biomedical research and so forth. And he told Baker that he was going to bring Yevgeny Velikov, who was previously had been the head of the Soviet version of the SDI, the Soviet beam weapons program, to the meeting at Camp David to make these proposals to George H.W. Bush. Then there's a document which is not a verbatim transcript, but the notes of the note taker reporting on the subsequent meeting in Camp David, where Yeltsin made the same proposal to George H.W. Bush. Cheney was there, Baker, George H.W., Colin Powell, I believe, Scowcroft, and they listened to Yeltsin's proposal and basically deferred, disregarded it, and it was never accepted. The only program that I believe was accepted was the proposal to recycle nuclear warheads for use in nuclear fuel for power plants. So again, a proposal that could have been a tremendous shift, a type of SDI, was rejected by the Bushies. And what ensued, we all know the history of what ensued. The US went into wars, forever wars in the Middle East. Our economy went into globalization under Clinton, who became incorporated basically into the Bush family. We had the World Trade Organization, the NAFTA, free trade, deindustrialization, all under this utopian dream that we have come to the end of history and a world government is now to be put in place based on a one world system under the banner of so-called democracy. But if you look at the economic policy that was implemented in that period, in that subsequent period, it had one underlying characteristic, which was a shift away from scientific and technological progress and towards deindustrialization, financialization, and various other forms of economic and social control. We all know what the result was. Ironically, the technological, economic technologies, which have basically been the base of the economy since that time, I'm talking particularly about the internet, automation, new materials, and so forth, in large part are based on scientific discoveries that were made primarily by the efforts around the Apollo project of Kennedy in the 1960s and the related investigations into the areas around the SDI. So, but none of those were really deployed in the way that LaRouche had envisioned. And instead, we've been through this, we've been through a similar period of these utopian dreams. On the one hand, you have people bellowing about what they today call peace through strength, which really had nothing to do with what Reagan called peace through strength. Reagan understood, and LaRouche, that what LaRouche was saying, that peace through strength was based on the strength of scientific and technological development and the application of those discoveries to economic progress. But today, people are running around talking about peace through strength when we have no strength because our economy has collapsed. Our scientific and technological progress is so diminished that our strength is diminished. Look at the results of the so-called military power we have over the last 30 years. Did we win those forever wars with our great power? Or did we end up enriching military defense contractors to produce more and more effective, more and more sophisticated weapon systems, which were outsmarted by the Taliban? I think you can draw these your own conclusions from that. So what is this? Today, the situation, as I said, is very different. You don't have really two competing blocks like the NATO, United States, and Warsaw Pact. This thing that Biden keeps harping on about democracies versus autocracies is a big sophistry. It doesn't exist. You have a situation where, as a result of the lack of investment and interest in frontier technologies, the United States again is behind technologically in certain areas, not only military areas, but also in economic areas, particularly, for example, in the areas of hypersonics. The Chinese have developed hypersonic technologies, missile technologies that surpass both the United States and Russia has developed hypersonic technologies that surpass the United States, and the United States even admits this, for example. So the situation today cannot be dealt with by a neocon policy of bluffing, peace through strength, and bluffing, as we see happening in, for example, with the United States and NATO's policy in Ukraine. It's insane. Or similarly, the utopian dreams that somehow the United States could engage in a military conflict with China in the Straits of Taiwan and somehow win. That's crazy. This is just insane. On the other hand, a peacenik movement that all sides should just get together and agree to love one another and bury the hatchet and not have any differences is also a utopian fantasy, which will lead just as quickly to the same conflicts that the neocons are trying to push us into. The solution is to take the principles that LaRouche outlined in his SDI and apply them today in the context of the situation we're dealing with. It's my opinion that I think this was the direction that Donald Trump was on when he was president and will be on when he retakes the White House in 2025. But it is our job to make sure that we understand what those principles are, so that the movement which brings Trump back into the White House understands these principles and is committed to it. Because we know from experience in the first Trump administration and from the experience in the Biden administration that the Bushies, whether in Democratic clothes, neocon clothes, Republican clothes, or peacenik clothes, are going to fight tooth and nail to push for their utopian dreams, which will lead to disaster. And we need to look at the kind of policies that Trump implemented and stated he would implement again. Why is Trump the only political figure right now, major political figure, who has consistently opposed the war in Ukraine and has pledged to stop it? So this is what I think LPAC's focus really needs to be over the coming period. We have to develop, explain, organize the way LaRouche did in his presidential campaigns in the 1970s and early 80s, where we built a mass movement for the principles of the SDI. We have to build a mass movement today for the same principles to be implemented as we fight to achieve this second official Trump administration. So that's what I will throw out to you for discussion, and look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. So before I go to questions, I actually wanted you to expound on something. So I had a question myself.
Okay.
Which, you at the end, you talked about, obviously people may know that Trump did put out a statement on the question of his missile defense plan in regards to the war in Ukraine and what's going on with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So in regards to what you were just discussing, I wanted to ask you to develop a little bit more in, that I believe Trump and all of his past history indicates he's very much aware of the Strategic Defense Initiative and how this can be applied to his development of a missile defense program would be extremely important for people to understand. So I wanted to see if maybe you had a little bit more on what Trump is proposing in terms of a defense plan, and if it could fall in line with the type of strategic defense initiative that would be required for today.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very good point. First of all, just historically, Trump in the 1980s was very supportive of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I think it's been publicized that in the mid 80s, late 80s, that Trump himself was seeking or offered himself to be a mediator between the Reagan administration and the Soviet government around the ideas of the SDI. Now, I believe at the time that Trump was seeking that role, it was already too late because the Soviets had rejected it. We were into the second Reagan administration, and George H.W. Bush had pretty much gotten control of the entire thing. George H.W. Bush was the saboteur of the Reagan administration from before he even got there. In the New Hampshire primary in 1980, in fact, LaRouche was the one who knocked George H.W. Bush out. George H.W. Bush had won the Iowa caucuses and was in line to win the New Hampshire primary, having a home in the neighboring state of Maine. And LaRouche was campaigning for the Democratic nomination in 1980 and was focusing a huge amount of his political efforts against George H.W. Bush. Reagan crushed Bush in the primary and went on to win the nomination. But the Republican establishment forced George H.W. Bush onto Reagan, and George H.W. Bush was the skunk at the party, sabotaging everything Reagan did. We can talk more about Bush if you want. So historically, Trump was on the side of Reagan and the SDI. I don't know what he knew about LaRouche at the time. I think Roger Stone has some things to say about that, but also and also about what Reagan thought about that. But when he was president, Trump did develop a proposal for a ballistic missile defense system, which has some of the right elements in it. And just recently, he put out a statement on Truth Social saying that when he becomes president, he will develop very quickly a defense against hypersonics weapons. That's all he said. It was very short and not real detailed. But I think you can get the best indication of where Trump would be thinking on this regard by what you mentioned, the two things. One is his Ukraine, his, of course, commitment to end the forever wars, and the way he sought to develop a shift in relations with North Korea and also China and Russia. Of course, he was sabotaged on the Russia side from the very beginning. And I think that was one of the main reasons, because the United States, because Trump saw the potential to combine this United States-Russian cooperation for technological and scientific progress. This would be very fruitful for the entire world. And Trump's commitment to the idea of national sovereignty and relations among nations based on national sovereignty. Before giving this class, I reread Trump's addresses to the United Nations that he gave in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. I recommend them. You should go back and read those. They're relatively short, and it doesn't take that long. But what Trump lays out there as a vision for how relations among nations should function, based on each nation putting their own citizens first and their national interests first, and on the basis of that, getting agreements for mutual cooperation in the interest of promoting the development of mankind, but also fighting the evils that mankind faces. And he outlined those in those speeches. So I think it's pretty clear from Trump's actions as president, his actions in this interregnum period, and his statements for the next administration, make it pretty clear that he's in our camp on this one. What I don't think is clear is that the American people, and especially the MAGA movement, are clear on these principles. I think they're clear on the need for them, but we need to deepen the understanding among the MAGA base, and not just the MAGA base, but even, large portions of people who may or may not consider themselves part of the MAGA base, to what these principles are. Because you hear a lot of sort of reactions, people reacting to the insanity of the Biden administration, and they're easily can get sidetracked into meaningless sort of posturing, like all this stuff around the balloon. Now, I'm told by people who know something about this that there are military applications to these balloons, and they can be a serious threat. I don't know if this particular balloon, the one that at least they say was from China, was such a military threat, but clearly allowing a balloon to traverse the entire airspace of the continent of the United States is a little bit, shows a great weakness. On the other hand, a lot of the hyperventilating around it also shows a similar weakness. And so we need the kind of peace through strength that LaRouche was talking about, strength based on science and technology. How can you claim to be strong when you have the kind of Green New Deal policy infecting the United States? And to listen to some of these Republican congressmen bloviate about how the United States has to build up its military and puff out its chest and back up Ukraine for whatever it takes, and that we're going to overthrow Putin and dismantle Russia and overthrow China. This is just insane when our country is in such a rotten shape. So we need to, I think Trump is aware of what it is. And I think if you sit down with the majority of people in the MAGA movement, they understand it. They understand what we need and what we don't have. But we have to deepen that understanding so that this really becomes solidified, both in order to win this election coming up, but also to make sure that when we do, we have the deep national public support for the real shift in policy that will end these utopian nightmares once and for all.
All right, good. I do have one more, which is at the center of Lynn's SDI program, Mr. LaRouche's SDI program, was from the standpoint of what you were just discussed around science and advanced technologies, was the advancement of lasers for beam weapon defense. And President Trump has also called for, in his missile defense program, the reinitiation and advancements of these laser defense systems. But I wanted you to maybe address that from the standpoint of how it advanced in the scientific community and with Los Alamos, and why, as you're saying, it wasn't just for missile defense, but this was also an improvement in the advanced technologies and scientific capabilities as well. So lasers was at the center of the program. So maybe you could touch on that a bit more.
Well, lasers were part of it, but there was something even more advanced than the lasers, and that's the directed energy beams, particle beams, that both the United States and the Soviets were working on. Much of this was top secret at the time, and so it wasn't really discussed. But subsequently, some of this stuff has been reported. And this also dovetails the development in fusion research and development of fusion energy, which is very much related, because what you're dealing with is harnessing plasma technologies and coherent beam technologies. And this has applications across the economic spectrum, especially in the development of fusion. Now, we've made tremendous potential progress in fusion, especially because we have a proliferation of approaches now. Whereas governments are focused on large projects like the ITER project in France, we have both private money as well as some government money, but largely private money in a whole variety of approaches to the development of fusion energy that are made possible by the development of superconducting magnets, as well as new technologies in the area of directed energy beams. And all this has military applications for beam defense, but it also has tremendous potential applications for development of fusion and other areas of technology. Biomedical research, for example, an X-ray laser, which would make it possible to actually observe living processes in situ, which would be a tremendous advance in biomedical research and a whole plethora of areas. But we just have to get back to the absolute commitment that we're going to develop scientific and technological breakthroughs, new technologies. The military applications in these areas is oftentimes has been in the past a great impetus for spinning off these technologies, as I indicated. But we can also do it across the board, not just in military technologies, but also for civilian peaceful purposes. Now, oftentimes these overlap, so it's kind of hard to say what whether it's purely civilian or purely military. But that area is the area to go. And that's the one that the American people got to get passionate about.